When Rover woke up, the sun was very low. The shadow of the cliffs was right across the sands, and Samathos was nowhere to be seen. A large seagull was standing close by him, and for a moment Rover was afraid that he might be going to eat him. But the seagull said, "Good evening. I have waited a long time for you to wake up. Samathos said that you would wake about tea time, but it is long past that now." "Please, what are you waiting for me for, Mr. Bird?" asked Rover very politely. "My name is Mew," said the seagull, "and I am waiting to take you away, as soon as the moon rises, along the moon's path. But we have one or things to do before that. Get up on my back and see how you like flying." Rover did not like it at all at first. It was all right while Mew was close to the ground, gliding smoothly along with his wings stretched out, stiff and still, but when he shot up into the air or turned sharp from side to side, sloping a different way each time, or stooped suddenly and steep, as if he was going to dive into the sea, then the little dog, with the wind whistling in his ears, wished he was safe down on the earth again. He said so several times, but all that Mew would answer was, "Hold on, we haven't begun yet." They had been flying about like this for a little while, and Rover had just suddenly begun to get used to it, and rather tired of it, when suddenly, "We're off!" cried Mew, and Rover very nearly was off, for Mew rose like a rocket steeply into the air, and then set off at a great pace straight down the wind. Soon they were so high that Rover could see far away and right over the land. The sun was going down behind dark hills. They were making for some very tall black cliffs of sheer rock, too sheer for anyone to climb. At the bottom of the sea was splashing and sucking at their feet, and nothing grew on their faces, yet they were covered with white things, pale in the dusk. Hundreds of seabirds were sitting there on narrow ledges, sometimes talking mournfully together, sometimes saying nothing, and sometimes slipping suddenly from their perches to swoop and curve in the air before diving down to the sea far below where the waves looked like little wrinkles. This was where Mew lived, and he had several people to see, including the oldest and most important of all the black-backed gulls, and messages to collect before he set out. So he set Rover down on one of the narrow ledges, much narrower than a doorstep, and told him to wait there and not to fall off. You may be sure that Rover took care not to fall off, and that with a stiff sideways wind blowing, he did not like the feeling of it at all, crouching as close as he could against the face of the cliff and whimpering. It was altogether a very nasty place for a bewitched and worried little dog to be in. At last, the sunlight faded out of the sky entirely, and a mist was on the sea, and the first stars showed in the gathering dark. Then, above the mist, far out across the sea, the moon rose round and yellow and began to lay its shining path on the water. Soon after, Mew came back and picked up Rover, who had begun to shiver miserably. The bird's feathers seemed warmed and comfortable after the cold ledge on the cliff, and he snuggled in as close as he could. Then Mew leapt into the air far above the sea, and all the other gulls sprang off their ledges and cried and wailed goodbye to them, as off they sped along the moon's path that now stretched straight from the shore to the dark edge of nowhere. Rover did not know in the least where the moon's path led to, and, at present, he was much too frightened and excited to ask. And anyway, he was beginning to get used to extraordinary things happening to him. As they flew along above the silver shimmer on the sea, the moon rose higher and grew whiter and more bright, till no star dared to stay anywhere near it, and it was left shining all alone in the eastern sky. No doubt, Mew was going by Samathos' orders to where Samathos wanted him to go, and no doubt Samathos helped Mew with magic, for he certainly flew faster and straighter than even the great gulls ordinarily fly, even straight down the wind when they are in a hurry. Yet it was ages before Rover saw anything except the moonlight in the sea below, and all the time the moon got bigger and bigger, and the air got colder and colder. Suddenly, on the edge of the sea, he saw a dark thing, and it grew as they flew towards it, until he could see that it was an island. Over the water, and up to them, made the sound of a tremendous barking, a noise made up of all different kinds and sizes of barks there are. Yaps and yelps and yammers and yowls, growling and grizzling, whickering, whining, snickering and snarling, mumping and moaning, and the most enormous baying, like a giant bloodhound on the back of an ogre. All Rover's fur around his neck suddenly became very real again, and stood up, stiff as bristles, and he thought he would like to go down and quarrel with all the dogs there at once, until he remembered how small he was. "That's the Isle of Dogs," said Mew, or rather the Isle of Lost Dogs, where all the lost dogs go that are deserving or lucky. It isn't a bad place, I'm told, for dogs. They can make as much noise as they like without anyone telling them to be quiet or throwing anything at them. They have a beautiful concert, all barking together their favorite noises. whenever the moon shines bright. They tell me there are bone trees there too, with fruit like juicy meat bones that drops off the trees when it's ripe. No, we are not going there just now. You see, you can't be called exactly a dog, though you are no longer quite a toy. In fact, Samathos was rather puzzled, I believe, to know what to do with you when you said you didn't want to go home. Where are we going to, then? Asked Rover. He was disappointed at not having a closer look at the Isle of Dogs after he heard of the bone trees. Straight up the moon's path to the edge of the world, and then over the edge and onto the moon. That's what old Samathos said. Rover did not like the idea of going over the edge of the world at all, and the moon looked like a cold sort of place. Why to the moon? He asked. There are lots of places on the world I have never been to. I've never heard of there being bones in the moon, or even dogs. There is at least one dog, for the man in the moon keeps one, and since he is a decent old fellow, as well as the greatest of all the magicians, there are sure to be bones for the dog, and probably for visitors. As for why you are being sent there, I dare say you will find that out in good time, if you keep your wits about you and don't waste time grumbling. I think it is very kind of Samathos to bother about you at all. In fact, I don't understand why he does. It isn't like him to do good things without a good big reason, and you don't seem good or big. Thank you, said Rover, feeling crushed. It is very kind of all these wizards to trouble themselves about me. I am sure, though, it is rather upsetting. You never know what will happen next, once you get mixed up with wizards and their friends. It is very much better luck than any yapping little pet puppy dog deserves, said the seagull, and after that they had no more conversations for a long while. The moon got bigger and brighter, and the world got darker and farther off. At last, all of a sudden, the world came to an end, and Rover could see the stars shining up out of the blackness underneath. Far down he could see the white spray in the moonlight where the waterfalls fell over the world's edge and dropped straight into space. It made him feel most uncomfortably giddy, and he nestled into Mew's feathers and shut his eyes for a long, long time. When he opened them again, the moon was all laid out below them, a new white world shining like snow, with wide open spaces of pale blue and green where the tall pointed mountains threw their long shadows far across the floor. On top of one of the tallest of these, one so tall that it seemed to stab up toward them as Mew swept down, Rover could see a white tower. It was white, with pink and pale green lines on it, shimmering as if the tower were built of millions of seashells, still wet with foam and gleaming, and the tower stood on the edge of a white precipice, white as a cliff of chalk, but shining with moonlight more brightly than a pane of glass far away on a cloudless night. There was no path down that cliff as far as Rover could see, but that did not matter at the moment, for Mew was sailing swiftly down, and soon he settled right on the roof of the tower, at a dizzy height above the moon world that made the cliffs by the sea where Mew lived seem low and safe. To Rover's great surprise, a little door in the roof immediately opened close beside them, and an old man with a long silvery beard popped his head out. "Not bad going, that," he said. "I've been timing you ever since you passed over the edge. 1,000 miles a minute, I should reckon. You are in a hurry this morning. I'm glad you didn't bump into my dog. Where in the moon has he got to now, I wonder?" He drew out an enormously long telescope and put it to one eye. There he is, he shouted, worrying the moonbeams again. Drat him. Come down, sir, he called up into the air, and then began to whistle a long, clear silver note. Rover looked up into the air, thinking that this funny old man must be quite mad to whistle to his dog up in the sky. But to his astonishment he saw far up above the tower a little white dog on white wings, chasing things that looked like transparent butterflies. "Rover, Rover," called the old man, and just as our Rover jumped up on Mew's back to say, "Here I am," without waiting to wonder how the old man knew his name, he saw the little flying dog dive straight down out of the sky and settle on the old man's shoulders. Then he realized that the man in the moon's dog must also be called Rover. He was not at all pleased, but as nobody took any notice of him, he sat down again and began to growl to himself. The man in the moon's Rover had great ears, and he at once jumped onto the roof of the tower and began to bark like mad. And then he sat down and growled. "Who brought that other dog here?" "What other dog?" said the man. "That silly little puppy on the seagull's back," said the moon dog. Then, of course, Rover jumped up again and barked his loudest. "Silly little puppy yourself! Who said that you could call yourself Rover, a thing more like a cat or a bat than a dog?" From which you can see that they were going to be very friendly before long. That is the way, anyhow, that little dogs usually talk to strangers of their own kind. "Oh, fly away, you two, and stop making such a noise. I want to talk to the postman," said the man. "Come on, Tiny Tot," said the moon dog. And then Rover remembered what a tiny tot was. Even beside the moon dog, who was only small, and instead of barking something rude, he only said, "I would like to, if only I had some wings and knew how to fly." "Wings," said the man on the moon. "That's easy. Have a pair and be off." Mew laughed and actually threw him off his back right over the edge of the tower's roof. But Rover had only gasped once and had only begun to imagine himself falling and falling down like a stone onto the white rocks in the valley miles below, when he discovered that he had got a beautiful pair of white wings with black spots to match himself. All the time, he had fallen a long way before he could stop, and he wasn't used to wings. It took him a little while to get really used to them, though long before the man had finished talking to Mew, he was already trying to chase the moon dog round the tower. He was just beginning to get tired by these first efforts when the moon dog dived down to the mountain top and settled at the edge of the precipice at the foot of the walls. Rover went down after him, and soon they were sitting side by side, taking breath with their tongues hanging out. "So are you called Rover after me?" said the moon dog. "Not after you," said our Rover. "I'm sure my mistress had never heard of you when she gave me my name." "That doesn't matter. I was the first dog that was ever called Rover, thousands of years ago, so you must have been called Rover after me. I was a rover, too. I never would stop anywhere or belong to anyone before I came here. I did nothing but run away from the time I was a puppy, and I kept on running and roving until one fine morning, a very fine morning, with the sun in my eyes, I fell over the world's edge, chasing a butterfly. A nasty sensation, I can tell you. Luckily, the moon was just passing under the world at that moment, and after a terrible time falling right through clouds and bumping into shooting stars and that sort of thing, I tumbled onto it, slap into one of the enormous silver nets that the giant gray spiders here spin from the mountain. I fell, and the spider was just coming down to his ladder to pickle me and carry me off to his larder when the man in the moon appeared. He sees absolutely everything that happens on this side of the moon with that telescope of his. The spiders are afraid of him because he only lets them alone if they spin silver threads and ropes for him. He more than suspects that they catch his moonbeams, and that he won't allow, though they pretend to live only on dragon moths and shadow bats. He found Moonbeam's wings in that spider's larder, and he turned him into a lump of stone as quick as kiss your hand. Then he picked me up and patted me and said, "That was too nasty a drop. You better have a pair of wings to prevent any more accidents. Now fly off and amuse yourself. Don't worry the moonbeams, and don't kill my white rabbits. And come home when you feel hungry. The window is usually open on the roof." I thought he was a decent sort, but rather mad. But don't you make that mistake about his being mad. I mean, I daren't really hurt his moonbeams or his rabbits. He can turn you into dreadfully uncomfortable shapes. Now, tell me why you came with the postman. "The postman?" said Rover. "Yes, Mew, the old sand sorcerer's postman, of course," said the moon dog. Rover had hardly finished telling the tale of his adventures when they heard the man whistling. Up they shot to the roof, where the old man was sitting, with his legs dangling over the edge, throwing envelopes away as fast as he opened the letters. The wind took them whirling off into the sky, and Mew flew after them and caught them and put them back into a little bag. "I've just been reading about you, Roverandom, my dog," he said. "Roverandom I call you, and Roverandom you'll have to be. Can't have two Rovers about here. And I quite agree with my friend Samathos. I'm not going to put in any ridiculous P to please him. That you had better stop here for a little while. I have also got a letter from Artaxerxes, if you know who that is, and even if you don't, telling me to send you straight back. He seems mighty annoyed with you for running away, and with Samathos for helping you. But we won't bother about him, and neither need you, as long as you stay here. Now fly off and amuse yourself. Don't worry the moonbeams, and don't kill my white rabbits. And come home when you are hungry. The window on the roof is usually open. Goodbye." He vanished immediately into thin air, and anybody who has never been there will tell you exactly how thin the moon air is. "Well, goodbye, Roverandom," said Mew. "I hope you enjoy making trouble among the wizards. Farewell for the present. Don't kill the white rabbits, and all will yet be well, or you will get home safe, whether you want to or not." Then Mew flew off at such a pace that before you could say whiz, he was a dot in the sky and then had vanished. Rover was now not only turned into toy size, but his name had been altered, and he was left all alone on the moon, all alone except for the man in the moon and his dog. Roverandom, as we had better call him too, for the present, to avoid confusion, don't mind. His new wings were great fun, and the moon turned out to be a remarkably interesting place, so that he forgot to ponder any more why Samathos had sent him there. It was a long time before he found out. All the meanwhile, he had all sorts of adventures, by himself and with the moon rover. He didn't often fly about in the air far from the tower, for in the moon, and especially on the white side, the insects are very large and fierce, and often so pale and so transparent and so silent that you hardly hear or see them coming. The moonbeams only shine and flutter, and Roverandom was not frightened of them. The big white dragon moths with fiery eyes were much more alarming, and there were sword flies and glass beetles with jaws like steel traps, and pale unicornets with stings like spears, and 57 varieties of spiders ready to eat anything they could catch, and worse than the insects were the shadow bats. Roverandom did what the birds do on that side of the moon. He flew very little except near at home, or in open spaces with a good view all around, and far from insect hiding places. And he walked about very quietly, especially in the woods. Most things there went about very quietly, and the birds seldom even twittered. What sounds there were made chiefly by the plants, the flowers, the white bells, the fair bells and the silver bells, the tinkle bells and the ring-a-roses, the rhyme-a-royals and the penny whistles, the tin trumpets and the cream horns, a very pale cream, and many others with untranslatable names, made tunes all day long, and the feather grasses and the ferns, fairy fiddle strings, polyphonies and brass tongues, and the kraken in the woods, and all the reeds by the milk-white ponds, they kept up the music softly, even in the night. In fact, there was always a faint thin music going on. But the birds were silent. A very tiny most of them were, hopping about in the gray grass beneath the trees, dodging the flies and the swooping flutterbys, and many of them had lost their wings or forgotten how to use them. Roverandom used to startle them in their little ground nests, as he stalked quietly through the pale grass, hunting the little white mice, or snuffing after gray squirrels on the edges of the woods. The woods were filled with silver bells, all ringing softly together when he first saw them. The tall black trunks stood straight up, high as churches, out of the silver carpet, and they were roofed with pale blue leaves that never fell, so that not even the longest telescope on earth has ever seen those tall trunks or the silver bells beneath them. Later in the year, the trees all burst together into pale golden blossoms, and since the woods of the moon are nearly endless, no doubt that alters the look of the moon from below on the world. But you must not imagine that all of Roverandom's time was spent creeping about like that. After all, the dogs knew that the man's eye was on them, and they did a good many adventurous things and had a great deal of fun. Sometimes they wandered off together for miles and miles, and forgot to go back to the tower for days. Once or twice they went up into mountains far away. Still looking back, they could see the moon tower only as a shining needle in the distance, and they sat on the white rocks and watched the tiny sheep, no bigger than the man in the moon's rover, wandering in herds over the hillsides. Every sheep carried a golden bell, and every bell rang each time each sheep moved a foot forward to get a fresh mouthful of gray grass, and all the bells rang in tune, and all the sheep shone like snow, and no one ever worried them. The rovers were much too well brought up, and afraid of the man, to do so, and there were no other dogs in all the moon, nor cows nor horses, nor lions nor tigers nor wolves. In fact, nothing larger on 4 feet than rabbits and squirrels, and toy-sized at that, except just occasionally to be seen standing solemnly in thought an enormous white elephant, almost as big as a donkey. I haven't mentioned the dragons, because they don't come into the story just yet, and anyway, they lived a very long way off, far from the tower, being all very afraid of the man in the moon except one, and even he was half afraid. Whenever the dogs did go back to the tower and fly in at the window, they always found their dinner just ready, as if they had arranged the time, but they seldom saw or heard the man about. He had a workshop down in the cellars, and clouds of white steam and gray mist used to come up the stairs and float away out of the upper windows. "What does he do with himself all day?" said Roverandom to Rover. "Do?" said the moon dog. "Oh, he's always pretty busy, though he seems busier than I have seen him for a long time since you arrived. Making dreams, I believe." "What does he make dreams for?" "Oh, for the other side of the moon. No one has dreams on this side. The dreamers all go round to the back." Roverandom sat down and scratched. He didn't think this explanation explained. The moondog would not tell him any more all the same, and if you ask me, I don't think he knew much about it. However, something happened soon after that put such questions out of Roverandom's mind altogether for a while. The two dogs went and had a very exciting adventure, much too exciting while it lasted, but that was their own fault. They went away for several days, much farther than they had ever been before since Roverandom came, and they did not bother to think where they were going. In fact, they went and lost themselves, and mistaking the way, got farther and farther from the tower when they thought they were getting back. The moondog said he had roamed all over the white side of the moon and knew it by heart. He was very apt to exaggerate, but eventually he had to admit that the country seemed a bit strange. "I'm afraid it's a very long time since I came here," he said, "and I'm beginning to forget it a bit." As a matter of fact, he had never been there before at all. Unawares, they had wandered too near to the shadowy edge of the dark side where all sorts of half-forgotten things linger and paths and memories get confused. Just when they felt sure that they were on the right way home, they were surprised to find some tall mountains rising before them, silent, bare, and ominous, and these the moondog made no pretense of ever having seen before. They were gray, not white, and they looked as if they were made of old, cold ashes, and long, dim valleys lay among them without a sign of life. Then it began to snow, as often does snow in the moon, and the snow, as they call it, is usually nice and warm and quite dry, and turns into fine white sand and all blows away. This was more like our sort. It was wet and cold, and it was all dirty. "It makes me homesick," said the moondog. "It's just like the stuff that used to fall in the town where I was a puppy, on the world, you know. Oh, the chimneys there, tall as moon trees, and the black smoke, and the red furnace fires. I get a bit tired of white at times. It's very difficult to get really dirty on the moon." And this rather shows up in the moondog's low tastes, and as there were no such towns in the world hundreds of years ago, you can see that he had exaggerated the length of time since he fell over the edge a very great deal too. However, just at that moment, a specially large and dirty flake had hit him in the left eye, and he changed his mind. "I think this stuff has missed its way and fallen off the beastly old world," he said. "Rat and rabbit it. And we seem to have missed our way altogether, too. Bat and bother it, let's find a hole to creep in." It took some time to find a hole of any sort, and they were very wet and cold before they did. In fact, so miserable that they took the first shelter they came to, and no precautions, which are the first things you ought to take in unfamiliar places on the edge of the moon. The shelter they crawled into was not a hole, but a cave, and a very large cave, too. It was dark, but it was dry. "This is nice and warm," said the moondog, and he closed his eyes and went off into a doze almost immediately. "Ow!" he yelped not long afterwards, waking straight up, dog fashioned out of a comfortable dream. "Much too warm." He jumped up. He could hear little Roverandom barking away further inside the cave, and when he went to see what was up, he saw a trickle of fire creeping along the floor towards them. He did not feel homesick for red furnaces just then, and he seized little Roverandom by the back of his little neck and bolted out of the cave as quick as lightning and flew up to a peak of stone just outside. There the two sat in the snow, shivering and watching, which was very silly of them. They ought to have flown off home, or anywhere, faster than the wind. The moondog did not know everything about the moon, as you see, or he would have known that this was the lair of the great white dragon, the one that was only half afraid of the man, and scarcely that when he was angry. The man himself was a bit bothered by this dragon. That dreaded creature was all that he called him, when he referred to him at all. All the white dragons originally came from the moon, as you probably know, but this one had been to the world and back, so he had learned a thing or two. He fought the red dragon in Caerdon's in Merlin's time, as you will find out in the more up-to-date history books, after which the other dragon was very red. Later he did lots more damage in the Three Islands and went to live on top of Snowdon for a time. People did not bother to climb up while that lasted, except for one man, and the dragon caught him drinking out of a bottle. That man finished in such a hurry that he left the bottle on the top, and his example has been followed by many people since. A long time since, and not until the dragon had flown off to Gwynfa, some time after King Arthur's disappearance, at that time when dragons' tails were esteemed a great delicacy by the Saxon kings. Gwynfa is not so far from the world's edge, and it is an easy flight from there to the moon for a dragon so titanic and so enormously bad as this one had become. He now lived on the moon's edge, for he was not quite sure how much the man in the moon could do with his spells and contrivances. All the same, he actually dared at times to interfere with the color scheme. Sometimes he let real red and green flames out of his cave when he was having a dragon feast or was in a tantrum, and clouds of smoke were frequent. Once or twice he had been known to turn the whole moon red or put it out altogether. On such uncomfortable occasions the man in the moon shut himself up and his dog, and all he said was, "That dratted creature again." He never explained what creature or where he lived. He simply went down into the cellars, uncorked his best spells, and got things cleared up as quick as possible. Now you know all about it, and if the dogs had known half as much, they would never have stopped there. But stop they did, at least as long as it had taken me to explain about the white dragon. And by that time the whole of them, white with green eyes and leaking green fire at every joint and snorting black smoke like a steamer, had come out of the cave. Then he let off the most awful bellow. The mountains rocked and echoed, and the snow dried up, avalanches tumbled down, and waterfalls stood still. That dragon had wings like the sails that ships had when they were still ships and not steam engines. It did not disdain to kill anything from a mouse to an emperor's daughter. He meant to kill those two dogs, and he told them so several times before he got up into the air. That was his mistake. They both whizzed off like their rock like rockets, and they went away down the wind at a pace that Mew himself would have been proud of. The dragon came after them, flapping like a flapdragon and snapping like a snapdragon, knocking the tops of mountains off and setting all the sheep bells ringing like a town on fire. Now you see why they all had bells. Very luckily, down the wind was the right direction. Almost a most stupendous rocket went up from the tower as soon as the bells got frantic. It could be seen all over the moon like a golden umbrella, bursting into 1,000 silver tassels, and it caused an unpredicted fall of shooting stars in the world not long after. If it was a guide to the poor dogs, it was also meant as a warning to the dragon, but he had got far too much steam up to take any notice. So the chase went fiercely on. If you have ever seen a bird chasing a butterfly, and if you can imagine a more than gigantic bird chasing two perfectly insignificant butterflies among white mountains, then you can just begin to imagine the twistings, dodgings, hairbreadth escapes, and the wild zigzag rush of that flight home. More than once, before they got even halfway, Roverandom's tail was singed by the dragon's breath. What was the man in the moon doing? Well, he let off a truly magnificent rocket, and after that had said, "Drat that creature, and also, drat those puppies. They will bring on an eclipse before it is due." And then he went down into the cellars and uncorked a dark black spell that looked like a jellified tar and honey, and smelt like the 5th of November and cabbage boiling over. At that very moment the dragon swooped up right over the tower and lifted a huge claw to bat Roverandom, bat him right off into the blank nowhere, but he never did. The man in the moon shot the spell up out of a lower window and hit the dragon splosh on the stomach, where all dragons are particularly tender, and knocked him crank sideways. He lost all his wits and flew bang into a mountain before he could get his steering right, and it was difficult to say which was most damaged, his nose or the mountain. Both were out of shape. So the two dogs fell in through the top window and never got back their breath for a week, and the dragon slowly made his lopsided way home, where he rubbed his nose for months. The next eclipse was a failure, for the dragon was too busy licking his tummy to attend to it, and he never got the black splashes off where the spell hit him, and I'm afraid they will last forever. They call him the mottled monster now.